Beloved, for today's sermon message, I'm especially grateful to share this unique offering, a conversation with my brother, Dr. Bram Wispelwey. For reasons that will soon become clear, his experiences and expertise will be incredibly helpful in informing how we are called to not just lament, but engage and respond in gospel-specific ways to the horrific injustice and violence being perpetrated with billions of our tax dollars. The images on the news are horrific, but the story that gets filtered to us here in the United States is often skewed at best and actively wrong at worst, and often intentionally so. So we're going to get into some of those reasons. This is not cause for despair, but actually a very hopeful chance for all of us to learn, because in learning, we get to know how to make the way forward by walking and know what to do. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Bram Wispelwey, an activist, a human rights activist and physician, and also my brother who I shared a room with growing up. Bram, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Seth, for having me on today.
That's Reverend Seth to you. Well, first of all, I gave a very basic bio. Can you share a little bit of who you are, not just credentials, but tell us a little bit about your path towards engagement with global health, even though you are based out of the United States?
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much. I'm, as you mentioned, a physician. I'm an internal medicine public health doctor. I also identify as an activist and organizer. And, a lot of my work really revolves around racial justice here in the United States and really anti-colonial health work in the occupied West Bank and in Palestine. My focus is on social justice. I work for a social justice health organization called Partners Health, working on the COVID response here in the United States. And my focus has always been, long before I was a doctor, a lot of my, forming, moments was that, as an activist, right? So, I used to do LGBT rights activism in the Southern United States and elsewhere. And these are some core components of what informs my approach to health, to wellness, and towards thriving.
Great, thank you. And I'd love to segue from there to have you tell us a little bit more specifically about the work you do in Palestine, because this isn't just charity and it's not just a project, it's actually an immersive part of your healthcare calling and work in a 12-month calendar year.
Absolutely. So I'm based, a good chunk of the year, about 2/3 of the year in Boston. I work at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And then about 1/3 of the year, 3 to 4 months of the year, prior to the pandemic at least, I spend in Palestine, so in the West Bank, with some refugee communities in the Bethlehem area and now the Nablus area. And so I've been involved with these communities. I've lived about half of the last decade in Israel and Palestine, and I've been involved with these communities for the last 4 years, essentially working with them to develop a community health program in response to a very fractured and fragmented health reality.
Thank you. Say a little bit more about that program and how especially it's rooted in relationship and the life there, and also the animating need that's being addressed by a community health program. What makes this so vital and life-changing?
Yeah, so we call ourselves Help for Palestine, and the way this group is really organized is, everyone who works for Help for Palestine, is employed is a refugee who lives in refugee camps. So Palestinians who are ethnically cleansed from their villages in 1948. And so, they're now living in very overcrowded refugee camps, basically 3-4 times as population dense as Manhattan, for example. And essentially, they're organizing themselves provide services, to provide opportunities, to provide connections to existing health centers, clinics, hospitals that are otherwise, they have tremendous barriers to access because of the situations they live under, which is a military occupation that's extraordinarily difficult.
Right. And you've actually kind of teed up my next question really well. But before we get to that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what makes these community health worker initiatives under military occupation in one of the most ostensibly developed countries, if we're talking about Israel, right? With, I think, the third best, right, healthcare in the world. What makes these community health worker initiatives so life-giving and especially just potent and justice driven, because they are so successful under the most crushing odds? Can you give us like kind of a concrete example related to just kind of everyday health needs, whether it's diabetes or so on, and why these kind of everyday health things are that much more fatal, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, the work we do, we call it accompaniment or social accompaniment. And really what it means is you're spending time, these are community health workers, are lay people who are trained in being able to deliver certain basic, health delivery points, checking people's blood pressure, blood sugar, getting them to appointments, checking in on them, making sure they have the medicines that they need, that they know when and how to take them. So all of those things that we might be able to take for granted, but under this situation, under living under military occupation and with a very fragmented and fractured health system, can be really quite difficult. So, when you have refugees caring for refugees across generations, it's really an empowering piece, and it's something that works really well in the United States. It works well around the world, and it's a form of care, a form of again, as we call it, accompanying people through the challenges in their life. And chronic diseases like diabetes, which are rampant in the occupied Palestinian territory, they're, in the best of circumstances, very difficult to manage, and in these kind of circumstances become almost impossible. And so what we're trying to do is really organize ourselves to take care of our community, take care of this community in a way that it hasn't been cared for by the international community, by its occupying power. Like you mentioned, Israel, one of the most efficient healthcare systems in the world, very successful, but doesn't serve half the population that's under its control. So certainly Palestinians are not beneficiaries of all the health advancements and technological advancements from Israel. Despite the fact that many Israelis, 1 in 10 Israelis, live in the occupied West Bank in close quarters with Palestinians.
Right, and even setting aside the geopolitical realities, which we'll get into next, this model of accompaniment is so beautiful at just a human level, and a testament to what's possible when people, as you mentioned, these other successful examples, take a healthcare approach that is rooted in relationship and connection. Partners in Health spearheaded so much of this. I encourage everyone who's watching to look up Health for Palestine and ways you can support the really life-changing stuff that's going on there. And accompaniment also hits me in a really powerful way, because as those who have followed any of my sermons and work know, a phrase I use a lot is embodied solidarity. I believe, and hope many others do, that those of us who claim to follow the way of Jesus, a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew born under occupation, that claim actually lays claims on us, that the way he modeled calls us to embodied solidarity with those he was accompanying and in relationship with, those who the occupying powers wanted to suppress. So we'll get back to that. I'm just saying that to remind myself. So you've mentioned a few times now military occupation, 1948 ethnic cleansing. I don't know if we've mentioned apartheid, but I'm hoping you can give us now, let's, step back a little bit to 30,000 feet and give us a snapshot of how did we get here and what does it look like?
Great, yeah, and I think the reality is all of those things and more, and including the apartheid and the occupation piece. There's also what's known as settler colonialism, and colonialism is obviously exploitation and domination of an indigenous community by foreign power, usually a European power, right? And they're exploiting indigenous resources and indigenous human beings in order to enrich themselves and in this sort of acquisitive or extractive accumulation and capitalism. And what settler colonialism is that's different is it doesn't look to exploit the indigenous person so much as it looks to eliminate them. And this is the kind of colonialism we have in the United States. This is exactly what was perpetrated against indigenous people in the United States by European colonists and eventually the American colonists. And so that's very similar situation as occurred in Palestine, right? There was a European settler colonial movement that started in the 19th century called Zionism, a political movement that sought, and this is in the words of its founding fathers and founding leaders from Theodore Herzl to Zev Jabotinsky to David Ben-Gurion, that the plan was to spirit away or to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians out of this land that would become Israel. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. The vast majority, 85%, over 700,000 Palestinians in 1947 and 1948 were either massacred, displaced, or forced to leave their places in historic Palestine and became refugees. Today, 2/3 of all Palestinians are living outside of historic Palestine. And you have still 7 million spread out between the occupied Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and West Bank, as well as 20% of the population of Israel. So now you have this settler colonial process that in many ways has been less successful than the United States or Canada or Australia or some other examples. And so you still have half the people in the historic Palestine are Palestinians who have remained. But this sets up a constant conflict because the forced displacement, or when you have forced displacement that's by one more powerful ethnic or racial group over another, it's called ethnic cleansing. When you have that ethnic cleansing that's at the bedrock of this political movement, then that continues to this present day. And so what we have right now, this past week, starting in Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, is this ongoing ethnic cleansing, or ongoing Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. It's just another example, and hundreds, not thousands of Palestinians are displaced still every single year. So this is very much, it's not a single event. It's an ongoing, continuous reality, this settler colonialism. And part of that is now that, the majority of Palestinians in historic Palestine are under military occupation, or in the case of Gaza Strip, an illegal blockade or siege. And so, that's one other piece. And then, as has been documented now by the leading Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, and a Nobel Prize winning human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, just in the last couple of months, that the situation between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River is now one, and Palestinians have been saying it has been this for a very long time, but now it's acknowledged by leading Israeli organizations and global organizations that this is one of apartheid and Jewish supremacy, and it's entrenched in the fundamental core laws of the Israeli state that puts the rights and privileges of Jewish people over any other people, and in particular Palestinians, be they Christian or Muslim.
You mentioned the Nakba, the catastrophe, and how it's ongoing. You and I are speaking on May 15th. This service is going to publish May 16th, but today is called Nakba Day, which just amplifies the horrors of the past week, this ongoing catastrophe. And as you articulated extremely well, thank you, that Gaza, for example, for a long while now, until it was really kind of ratified by these leading organizations, was known as an open air penal colony. 97% of the water, I believe, is undrinkable. And then but you know, these are statistics. I wonder if you can give us, before we get into what's going on specifically in the past week, a little bit more, bring us down from 30,000 feet. What does it mean that we, what does life look like? You know, the walls, the military checkpoints, the constant terror and threat and home break-ins even before this week. What does it look like to be Palestinian or an Arab citizen of Israel? Just a snapshot would be supremely helpful.
Yeah, and of course, and it's actually quite difficult to give a generic
Sure.
version of what a Palestinian, lives under, because in fact, as in all colonial contexts, they've been divided into different levels of privilege and oppression. And so the sort of the best off scenario for Palestinians is to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel, one of the 20% of that has citizenship, but they are second-class citizens within Israel. There are over 65 laws that are passed that discriminate against them. And then in the most extreme situation, on the other side, you have the Gaza Strip, where they're living under a siege for the last 14 years that is extremely debilitating, and numerous wars, which, this is a largely defensive population, and an average age of 17 years, that is been attacked by one of the world's strongest militaries, the only nuclear power in the Middle East, the sixth largest arms dealer in the world, and the largest recipient of United States aid at the tune of $3.8 billion a year. So it's essentially the ultimate David versus Goliath story, essentially reversed. So that's the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, where we work, I'll give you a sense. So in Aida refugee camp, for example, you have a situation where you're walled off on two sides by the separation wall, sometimes called the apartheid wall, which is twice as high as the Berlin Wall, which was built illegally inside what was supposed to be a Palestinian state. It takes an additional 12% of the land that was designated for a Palestinian state under the UN, and it has 6 guard towers surrounding the camp, right? So this is like the total sort of military occupation ghetto, and well over 30 cameras, so monitoring everything that's happening in the camp at all times. You have a gate connected right outside, right next to, within the camp, that's connected to an Israeli military base. And you have sometimes nightly raids, certainly at least weekly. It happens all the time when I'm there. Raids of the soldiers into people's homes, usually 3, 4 in the morning, terrorizing the family, destroying their home, arresting people, men, women, children, as young as 12, 10, and simply for harassment, because you have this small population of soldiers trying to control much larger population in the West Bank. That's part of it. So the terror of the military coming in at night. This is the most tear gas population in the world. So regularly facing tear gas, skunk water, noise bombs, rubber bullets, and now more and more live fire. And children have been killed by snipers and people as well. So these are all aspects of what it looks like to live in a refugee camp in the West Bank, right? And this is not even necessarily the worst off, right? Many Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon are worse off, and in Gaza certainly. So and what that means is, even there's a clinic a few kilometers away, right, that's run by the UN. It's there's regular stockouts. The budget, is frequently being cut by, first and foremost, the United States in 2017. And logistically, it can be a nightmare even to get there. Sometimes the camp's under lockdown because it's being attacked by the army. And so all of these situations create an inability to be healthy, to thrive, to access medical care. And many types of medical care are not available in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and so people have to apply for permits that are often not forthcoming, and then you're just out of luck. And so this is the reality that really people are living under on a day-to-day basis in the best of times in the West Bank, in Palestinian refugee camps.
Thank you so much for that, and that tees up my last couple of questions really well. One, we've talked a lot since the uprising following the murder of George Floyd, state-sanctioned, state-funded, about how people of color in the United States are criminalized essentially for being people of color, and that we've just gotten, since the days of chattel slavery and Jim Crow, a little extra clever at how that manifests itself through redlining, police being the front line of the color line, and so on. And using the word apartheid, people, most of us here watching probably have a working knowledge of what that looked like under South Africa, and the criminalization of non-white citizens of that country, which leads to your mention of the word war, and war being done. War sometimes though brings up in our mind a two sides connotation. And this sets up my next question though, which is, we're really not talking about that there is a people group here that's been criminalized. War is being enacted upon them. And as you also mentioned, we're talking about essentially defenseless, that media narratives that talk of like, oh, there's clashes or there's conflict or thousands of rockets and Israel responded. And the president recently said, I haven't seen a significant overreaction, continues to perpetuate this idea that two sides are going at some kind of neutral middle line of disagreement. And can't we all wish for peace? But really what's going on here, and this is leading to the question of hopefully a snapshot of what's going on this week, is not war, but extermination, because these weapons, many of which come from the United States, including the tear gas, there are not even sides here. And there is an ideology at place, a supremacist one that seeks to, that's the end goal, destroy, not win over something. Can you say a bit more about that, leading into how this conflict, I say with tongue in cheek, over Sheikh Jarrah, right? These forced displacements, not evictions because they were illegal, all of a sudden now has turned into the obliteration of families in Gaza, which is on the other side of Israel.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think it's really important, that point you made, which is, the both sides, the conflict, the clashes, all of these things, imply a reality that's just non-existent, right? And both sides is really the equivalent of all lives matter in the United States, right? So, this is important to make this clear. What's happening currently now, and what has led to this, was an intentional instigation, by the Israeli government, by the Netanyahu government. During Ramadan, they intentionally started harassing Palestinians at Damascus Gate, not letting them spend time in East Jerusalem, where they traditionally are during Ramadan, young people, leading to flare-ups with the security forces. And then two situations, and East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank. It's under occupation, illegal occupation. And in two cases, the Temple Mount, where Al-Aqsa Mosque is, behind the Western Wall, the army invaded and attacked worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is a form during Ramadan. This is a form of attack and violation that Israel knows directly will lead to an escalation, right? This is how the Second Intifada started, when Ariel Sharon went onto the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is not controlled by Israel. It's controlled by it's controlled by Jordan. They're not allowed up there. So they knew, by going up there and violating these worshipers during the holy month of Ramadan, that this was going to create an escalation. And so Hamas gave Israel 2 hours to leave the Temple Mount and to release all the prisoners that had taken illegally. And they refused to do so. And then they said, we will fire rockets, and they did. And then that was the excuse that Israel needed, and it intentionally provoked that in order to then use all the power at its disposal, which is some of the most extreme in the world, to bombard the Gaza Strip, which is going on right now and has been, and well over 30 children today. Last night, 8 children and 1 family were killed in a single strike. And this is the reality. And again, as I made clear before, this is one of the most powerful armies and air forces in the world, one of the largest arms dealers, even separate from all the arms they're forced to buy from the United States as part of their agreement, and versus a population that uses simply homemade rockets as a form of protest when their rights are so heavily abused. And so there are no two sides. There is no conflict. The Iron Dome that's provided by the United States shoots down well over 90% of these rockets, a quarter of which don't even leave the Gaza Strip because they're so sort of weak. And so, you know, and I've lived through on the Israel side, the 2012 war, quote unquote, you know, and it's not really a war. So I know exactly what it's like on the Israeli side, and all the propaganda you see about what Israelis living through right now is exactly that. It's propaganda. They have bomb shelters. We have bomb shelters there, able to protect ourselves. Palestinians in Gaza have no such safety and security. And so you really have a situation of basically dropping bombs in a fishbowl of a population, as you said, Seth, that is living in the world's largest open air prison, without barely any potable water, without basic rights or basic things that we all require for you know, thriving and living.
Thank you for that. And that then tees up our last couple of questions. I'm just super grateful for this time. And no matter how it ends, it'll be shorter than a usual sermon of mine. The U.S. complicity, right? You know, so much focus on the media narrative is on rockets, which is almost its own distraction because there are so many ways of Palestinian resistance. There's this focus on Hamas and everything, but I'd say the work you do, sowing life, community health workership, relationships amidst all this trauma. Obviously, the videos I've seen and you've seen of the murder of these children are nauseatingly horrific. And the trauma for survivors is like an ongoing death unto itself for the remainder of life. And so speak a little bit more about the US investment, because this then gets to our final question is then how then shall we respond? Where do we locate ourselves as respondents? It's not just, oh, look at that horror over there. There are billions of reasons we are connected to this. Can you spell that out a little bit more? Not just the specifics, like this is how much money a year and this is where the tear gas is made, but the way the media is shaped and this sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the United States, without United States complicity, and really goes beyond that. I mean, the United States is, you know, Israel is largely a client state of the United States, you know, that without US support and basically US coverage for Israeli impunity and war crimes, crimes against humanity that have been documented, in which is currently a case is proceeding at the International Criminal Court. You know, all of these things are all covered by the US. The US covers Israel every time, even when it's unanimous votes in the UN to condemn Israeli actions or to, you know, acknowledge them as illegal, including West Bank settlements. The US always blocks everything. So essentially the US is completely a partner in all criminal activity by the Israeli state. And therefore, you know, even complicity isn't strong enough when you're talking about the massacre of Palestinians that's happening right now in terms of US involvement. The reason I say this, is disturbing as it is and terrible as it is to hear, it's also a source of hope, because it means that we as American citizens, by pressuring our government, you know, we now have Congress people who are literally on the floor, you know, just in the last couple of days speaking up on behalf of Palestinian rights. These are huge gains. Big progress is being made. And if the American people decide no more, we are not going to support this, we are going to absolutely condition aid to Israel. We are absolutely going to be in favor of boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. You know, that all of these things in order to hold Israel accountable for its crimes. You know, if the American people decide to do that, then you're going to talk about a changed reality, right? It's the same thing when in South Africa, you had complete US support almost until the very end. You had Israel support throughout. You know, also the last two countries supporting apartheid South Africa were the United States and Israel. And that's not a coincidence. And so, you know, but up until, you know, people thought it was still really far away up until the very end. And so the end is going to happen. You know, justice will win out. The outrage is there. You can't hide this anymore. It's all being seen on video. And people are really explicating the situation well and the context well. And so it's really incumbent on us to pressure politicians to organize ourselves to demand that this stop. And if we can do that as Americans, you know, along with other countries in the world, but especially in the United States, then we can change that reality. We can end apartheid, we can end occupation, and have, you know, really Palestinians who are liberated.
Amen to that. Thank you. And you know, this will be the last word I'll give to you by saying certainly anti-Semitism is never okay, but Zionism is something else, and Zionism is perpetrated by many, including by many Republicans, by many Christians or self-proclaimed Christians, many of whom are profoundly anti-Semitic in the pursuit of their Zionism and their own ends. And I think this also then speaks to our purposes here today, not just as taxpaying citizens, but as people who make certain claims. How would you ask people who make claims to this Jesus person we talk about here at Rincon and get talked about in a lot of progressive Christian spaces, to how we respond and engage in this moment, now that we have this learning to be against the violence of Zionism, because that is such a key part. You know, these white, ostensibly Christian Republican Zionists, for example, like the former secretary, the most recent Secretary of State before this new administration, are actively sowing the ideology that leads to the violence we're seeing this week. How can people who are potentially overwhelmed also speak truth in that regard?
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up an important point, Seth, which is that the majority of the Zionists in the United States and in the world, in fact, are Christians. They're not Jews, right? And so it is very important to distinguish this political philosophy from a religion or an ethnicity, right? And you know, the thing about what you're mentioning about Christian values and progressive values and humanist values is simply to utilize all those same values that you take towards racial justice, that you take towards social justice, and apply them to Palestinian. To Israel-Palestine, right? So same thing, right? In the same way you would fight, you know, tooth and nail against racism in the United States, against anti-Semitism, right? This is the same thing. So, you know, fighting on behalf of an oppressed and brutalized community is part of the values of being a progressive Christian. And while there's been a smokescreen about this question about you know, what is right here, you know, I hopefully this discussion today and sort of the ongoing news that comes out of this, you know, there have both been fantastic things published in the Washington Post, for example, by Rashid Khalidi and others. So, you know, you have actually sources even in the mainstream media to sort of clarify what's going on here. And so I think, you know, hold on to those values and apply them equally to the case of Palestinians, and deeply understand that is in no way, despite any accusations that might be thrown against you, it is in no way anti-Semitic to do so. It is not, as the opposite. You're being anti-racist in a full and complete way in your application. And just to clarify that even further, some of the greatest allies in the United States right now for Palestinian justice are Jewish Americans, including groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace. And so, you know, by all means, join up with those folks who are doing some of the most important work, and I believe will change the game when it comes to Palestinian rights.
That's right. There's a rally here in Tucson with a lot of anti-racist groups and Jewish Voice for Peace local. Whether it's on Monday, I will be there. Invite others to come and also to check out these pieces and organizations Bram has mentioned, as well as Help for Palestine. And I know we could keep talking for a long time, but we'll need to tie it off. This has been supremely helpful. I know not just for me, and I also know I'm not just speaking for myself when I say that we are all here holding you and those very dear friends and colleagues of yours in love and light who are currently in these places and not sure whether they're going to make it through the night, tonight, tomorrow night, and the week. And praying the life-giving work can continue, and recognizing, even as we lament and maybe tempted to throw up our hands, that actually we are intimately woven into this story, even though it's happening, quote unquote, over there, that these are conversations we need to have. Same as when we gnash our teeth about how to talk to relatives who vote a different way. The ideologies at play are having horrific outcomes that are no different from apartheid South Africa, Jim Crow America, and so on, and devastatingly worse, and all avoidable if we flex our Christian muscles, our taxpayer muscles, and more. And it's trite, but it's also scripture that knowing the truth will set us free. And I can't thank you enough for pulling the veil on so much of that truth for us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Reverend Seth, for having me on. And
thank you. And remember to take care of yourself, Dr. Bram.